So I just got back from seeing Yesterday in theaters, which is something that I paid money for. The logic of this movie makes no sense, and it's actually really amusing. It's probably the most entertaining thing about the movie. First of all, well, if you don't know, the premise of the movie is that there's a blackout and nobody remembers the Beatles except for this one guy. And it's up to him to steal their work and tell their story. It's actually never explained why Jack, who's the main character's name, remembers who the Beatles are. Because basically what happens is he's riding home on his bike, you know, how you bike, and there's a blackout, and he's like, oh shit, a blackout. And he gets distracted and a bus hits him. And when he's in the hospital and like his manager comes to visit him, she's like, oh yeah, the whole world blacked out for 12 seconds. And I guess that we're just meant to believe that that's why people don't remember who the Beatles are. But the thing is, Jack was fully conscious for the blackout. Like, if the bus had hit him and then the whole world blacked out and like that was meant to be the explanation, that would have made a little bit of sense, kind of. But he was fully awake for the blackout, and then a bus hit him, and then he woke up in the hospital. So he should forget the Beatles too, it's only just. The second thing that doesn't make any sense, and this was actually really disappointing, was that for some reason Ed Sheeran is in this movie. He just is. And when I saw this in the trailer, I thought the gag was gonna be like, the audience knows that it's Ed Sheeran, like this major pop star, he's got a huge career. But in the movie, because the Beatles never existed, he doesn't have a career, and so he's just like a regular dude that Jack knows and is friends with. But no, he's just Ed Sheeran. He's still a major pop star, because if the Beatles were wiped from history, the music industry wouldn't change at all. Why would you think that? Yeah, it was really weird. And because Ed Sheeran was in the movie, they had, I guess, the rights to all his songs. So in between scenes, like maybe it would be playing on the car, or like it was somebody's ringtone for way too many times during the movie, but Shape of You would just start playing. And I don't know why, because you would have these really, especially there was this one really like sentimental scene, or like meant to be sentimental, and then immediately after you just hear Shape of You playing, and it cuts to Ed Sheeran answering his phone. Shape of You is his own ringtone. This movie doesn't make any sense. Also, for some reason, cigarettes don't exist in this universe, which is really strange, because it's not like the Beatles really popularized cigarettes. Like, people were smoking cigarettes long before the Beatles were a thing. If you watch old movies from like the 1920s or the 1930s, people are definitely smoking cigarettes. So I don't know where this idea that if the Beatles never existed, there would be no cigarettes came from. And it's not even like, oh, smoking just isn't as popular. Jack is like, man, I could use a cigarette. And the person that he's talking to is like, what's a cigarette? So Jack goes back and he Googles cigarette, and there's like no results, or like the only result is like a town in France or something. It doesn't make any sense, and I'm confused. Something that I thought was really funny was that there was maybe one of the most egregious product placements I've ever seen in a movie. So Jack is in his room stealing songs like you do, and his mom walks in and hands him a Pepsi, and he goes, "We don't have any Coke?" And she's like, "What?" And he goes, "Like a Coca-Cola." She's like, "I have no idea what you're talking about." I mean, what better way to support a product than to wipe its competitor from the face of the earth and just have that be canon in your movie for no reason that makes sense to the plot. You know how famous the Beatles were for their Coca-Cola? That's what I remember most about the Beatles. During the third act of the movie, it finally decides to address the big question: are John and George still alive? The answer is yes, but you're gonna wish they weren't. So how this goes down is Once Jack is like really successful and he does a knockoff of the rooftop concert, these two people go backstage to talk to him. And when the person at the door was like, there's two people here to see you, I was like, oh shit, it's gonna be like two of the Beatles. It wasn't, because no way in hell are Paul and Ringo gonna sign on to be in this movie. It was just two people that like also remembered the Beatles, and it's not explained at all. They're just like, we remember, but we're not mad because we like the songs. And then the two people hand Jack an address. So he follows this address and he goes to this house in the middle of nowhere, and lo and behold, it's John Lennon. John Lennon has become an artist, like a painter, which is actually the one thing about this movie that I really liked, because that was probably the most accurate thing, because he did do artwork when he was younger, so I thought that that was cool. But anyway, he goes to John Lennon's house, and the guy opens the door, and at first I'm like blown away. I'm like, holy shit, this guy looks so much like John Lennon, this is crazy. And then Jack says, "Are you John?" And the actor goes, "Yes." They couldn't have even had a voice coach in who like knows the Liverpool accent, because it's very distinctive. And Jack goes, "From Liverpool?" And John is like, "Yeah." Anyway, they have this pointless conversation, and then Shape of You starts playing again. I wish I was kidding, I'm not. The ending of this movie was also like weirdly unsatisfying. Basically, and this scene was really confusing, but I get that they had to do this because like stealing is bad. Because he's just buddies with famous pop star Ed Sheeran now, after talking with John Lennon, realizes that he has to tell everybody the truth. So he gets Ed Sheeran to like put him in the middle of his set, because that's how concerts work. So he does a few songs, and then after the songs, he turns to the audience and he's like, basically just flat out says, "None of these songs are mine, but it's okay because I wanted to share the artistry of the Beatles with the world." And everyone's just like fine with it. Like there's still paparazzi chasing him afterwards. And then after he admits to that, he tells the girl love interest that he loves her. And the audience is like, "Aw," as if he didn't just admit to committing a major fraud for like presumably months. It's very strange, and I'm confused. And then you would think, because when he's admitting to having stolen these songs, he like says the names of the people that he stole them from. So you would think, because we've already established that John Lennon is alive, clearly, even though he sounds like he's been smoking for 50 years, you would think that John, Paul, George, and Ringo, there would be something involving them where like, now that Jack has like put their names forward into the world, they all meet, I guess for the first time, and like start writing together even though they're old. And it's like really sweet because now the Beatles exist, you know, everyone's happy. No, that doesn't happen. Nothing even related to that happens. You never hear from any of the other Beatles. Literally the ending of this movie is just, "and they lived happily ever after," but in film form. You know, Jack is singing Beatles songs still for some reason to like school children because his girlfriend is a teacher. I don't know. And then it just ends. He never really faces any consequences. I mean, he gets with the girl that he loves, and he's still performing. I mean, even if it's just to kids, like, he's definitely still performing. And not even with his own songs, like, he's still singing Beatles songs. It's fine. Another thing that didn't make any sense was when he realizes that, like, nobody knows who the Beatles are. He goes home and Googles the Beatles, and obviously it's like, whoa, it's showing the Bug, the Beatle. What? But then he Googles other bands that are like associated with the Beatles, sort of. He Googles the Rolling Stones, and they still exist. Yeah, the Rolling Stones' first hit was a song written by John Lennon and Paul McCartney. So they definitely shouldn't exist. I feel like not a lot of research was done for this movie, which sucks, because, I mean, if it had had more development and more research done into like what the world, especially the world of music, would actually be like if the Beatles had never existed, that could be really interesting, and it would have been a good concept, but oh well. I'm confused.